My daughter passed me a secret note at her own wedding that read, "Dad, help me." 40 seconds later, the groom was staring at a sheriff, a private investigator's file, and the end of everything. My daughter was walking toward me in her mother's wedding dress when she pressed the note into my hand. I was standing at the end of the aisle on a September Saturday with 200 people behind me and a string quartet playing something I'd approved 3 months ago without really hearing it, watching Grace come through the barn doors in the altered ivory dress that had lived in a cedar chest for 19 years, and I was doing what fathers do at moments like this, holding it together by a margin so thin it barely qualified as holding. She reached me, took my arm, and with her bouquet pressed between us, something small and folded landed in my palm. I didn't look at it. Not yet. I walked, kept my eyes forward, kept my face the face of a father walking his daughter down the aisle on a clear Wyoming morning with the September light coming gold through the barn's old windows and 200 people watching every step. I unfolded the note with one hand, 4 words, and a period. "Dad, help me." I know. I read it twice. The music kept playing. My boots kept moving. The barn kept being beautiful. And Gavin Hatcher, standing at the end of that aisle in a suit that cost more than my first truck, watched us come toward him with the easy smile of a man who had already decided how this day was going to end. He had no idea. I want to be honest about something before I tell this story. I liked Gavin. That's the part that nobody wants to admit, because it complicates the narrative and makes the teller sound gullible, and I am not a gullible man. I spent 40 years as a structural engineer, bridges primarily, then industrial construction, and the single most transferable skill that profession gave me was the ability to look at something and identify without sentiment exactly where the load-bearing weakness was. I am good at finding cracks. I liked Gavin anyway. He was 34 years old when Grace brought him home for the first time, a Thursday evening in November, 18 months before the wedding. Strong jaw, easy laugh. He helped clear the dinner table without being asked, which is a test I've been running on dinner guests for decades. Not because I care about dishes, but because how a person behaves in someone else's kitchen when no one's watching tells you something real. He shook my hand like he meant it, asked about the ranch's history with what seemed like genuine interest, listened when I answered, which is rarer than it should be. My daughter Grace is 28. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's stubbornness and her mother's ability to love something so completely that it reorganizes the rest of her life around that love. Linda died 6 years ago, pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end, and in the years since, I have watched Grace carry that loss the way she carries everything, quietly, with more grace than the situation deserved, without complaint. When she looked at Gavin, she looked the way Linda used to look at the ranch at sunset, like something she couldn't believe was real, so I kept my mouth shut. The first time Gavin asked about the property line, we were walking the south fence in December, and I told him, 215 acres, creek access on the eastern boundary, timber on the north 40. I told him because it was a normal question and he was my daughter's boyfriend and I had no reason not to. The second time I figured he'd forgotten. People forget things. I told him again. The third time was in the kitchen, and he asked about the creek access specifically, whether it ran year-round, whether there were any water rights attached. I answered. Told myself I was imagining the specificity of the question. The fourth time was during a dinner with 2 of Grace's friends, and Gavin steered the conversation to Wyoming property values, with the casual ease of a man changing lanes on an empty highway. Natural, frictionless. I watched it happen and felt something I didn't name yet. The fifth time, we were on the porch and he asked about development potential on the North 40. Had I ever had it assessed? Did I know what that timber was worth per acre? Something in my gut twisted hard and didn't untwist. I spent 40 years as an engineer. I know what it means when the same crack appears in the same place 5 times. It means someone has been pushing on it. I called my attorney Naomi Rusk on a Saturday morning in February, sitting in my truck at the end of the driveway where Grace couldn't hear me through the kitchen window. Naomi has been my attorney for 22 years. She's 61, compact, the kind of woman who reads contracts the way I read blueprints, looking for what isn't there as much as what is. She handled Linda's estate. She knows the ranch's full picture, which is more complicated than it looks from the outside. The outside looks like a man in worn jeans who drives a 2009 Ford F-150 and fixes his own fences, which is accurate. It doesn't include the 11 patents I hold on construction load distribution systems, 2 of which are still generating royalty checks twice a year. It doesn't include the index funds Linda and I built over 30 years of not spending money we didn't need to spend. It doesn't include the ranch's current appraised value, which a Denver development group had assessed, unsolicited, at $4,200,000 the previous spring. The full picture, if you're counting, somewhere north of $12 million, held quietly in assets that don't announce themselves. I drive an old truck because I like old trucks. I wear worn jeans because they're comfortable. Nobody in Gavin Hatcher's social circle, as far as I could tell, knew any of this. But Gavin had been standing at my kitchen window staring at that North 40 for 3 months. Run a background check on Gavin Hatcher, I told Naomi. Thorough, whatever that means to you. She sighed, not dismissively, more like a person who has been in her profession long enough to recognize the shape of a story story before it's fully told. I'll call you back, she said. She called me back 3 days later. Come to the office, she said. Not on the phone. That sentence told me everything I needed to know about what she'd found. When Naomi says not on the phone, she means the information is either complicated, serious, or both. It was both. I sat across from Naomi's desk on a Tuesday afternoon while she laid it out in the methodical, sequence of facts way she has always delivered bad news. Gavin Randall Hatcher, born 1989, Scottsdale, Arizona. 2 prior engagements. Both women had fathers with significant assets. Both engagements ended, not gradually, not mutually, but specifically, within weeks of Gavin attending family meetings about estates and property transfers. The first was Rebecca Thornton, whose father owned a chain of equipment dealerships in Colorado. Gavin had attended 2 estate planning meetings as Rebecca's fiancé. 3 weeks after the second meeting, at which, according to Naomi's source, the estate structure was finalized and locked, Gavin ended the engagement. No explanation offered. Rebecca's father had told Naomi's contact, off the record. Gavin had asked very specific questions about inheritance timing and whether a spouse could access assets during probate, then vanished when the will was secured. The second was Sarah Mitchell, whose grandfather had left her a controlling interest in a small manufacturing company in New Mexico. Same pattern. Engagement, family financial discussions, specific questions about asset access, disappearance, no criminal charges, no lawsuits. Families with money don't sue over broken engagements. They tighten the paperwork and make it disappear, which is exactly what those families had done. This is a pattern, Naomi said. Sophisticated, patient, and clean enough that there's no legal exposure yet. Yet, I said. Grace has no significant assets in her own name, but if Gavin believes she'll inherit this ranch, he's already done his research, I said. Naomi nodded. I sat with that for a moment. 215 acres, $4 million in land, 12 million total, give or take, once you counted everything. My daughter, who was in love and had already chosen the dress. I need a private investigator, I said. Naomi opened her desk drawer and handed me a business card. Marco Reyes had 19 years with the Wyoming State Police before he went private. Financial crimes and fraud investigation, which meant he spent nearly 2 decades watching people construct elaborate architectures of deception and then take them apart piece by piece until the whole thing collapsed into a pile of evidence. He was 53 years old, spoke in the careful, complete sentences of a man who had learned that every word in a report can be cross-examined, and came recommended by Naomi with the specific note that he was expensive, thorough, and not dramatic. I hired him on a Wednesday. By Friday, with documentation I'd rather not detail, he had placed a legal GPS tracker on Gavin's vehicle. By the following Tuesday, he had begun pulling financial records through every legal avenue available. What he found over the next 6 weeks made my blood run cold in the specific way that cold has nothing to do with temperature. Gavin had already contacted 2 Wyoming property development companies. In both cases, he described the ranch with a level of detail that required either extensive research or direct observation. Acreage, boundary markers, creek access and its seasonal consistency, timber quality on the North 40, approximate development potential per acre. He had identified himself in both conversations as a future stakeholder with decision-making authority. Future stakeholder with decision-making authority. He was shopping my land before the wedding invitations went out. Marco found more. Email correspondence between Gavin and a real estate attorney in Cheyenne, a man named Curtis Webb who specialized in, as his website described it, complex property disputes and marital asset litigation. The emails discussed Wyoming's marital property statutes. Specifically, they discussed how inherited land is typically protected from marital asset claims, but how, under certain circumstances, a spouse who had contributed to the management or improvement of the property could petition for partial interest. They discussed timelines. How quickly could such a petition be filed? What would constitute sufficient grounds? The emails were dated 4 months ago. Gavin had been engaged to my daughter for 3 months at that point. He'd retained a property dispute attorney 1 month before he proposed. I sat in Marco's office on a gray March afternoon and read those emails 3 times. The space between my shoulder blades had gone tight in a way that didn't release when I moved. My hands were flat on the table, very still. He isn't marrying my daughter, I said. No, Marco said. He's executing an acquisition. Marco said nothing, because there was nothing to add. I drove home in the old truck, pulled into the driveway, sat for a while looking at the house Linda and I built in 1987, the house Grace grew up in, the house that had her mother's garden still running along the south wall, because neither of us could bring ourselves to change it. Inside, Grace was planning a wedding. I had a decision to make. The decision kept me up for 3 nights. Option 1, go to Grace immediately. Lay out the documents, tell her everything. I ran that scenario forward, and it kept ending the same way. Grace is her mother's daughter, which means she loves with her whole self and does not surrender that love easily or without a fight. She would want to believe I was wrong. She might think I was overreaching, a protective father seeing threats that weren't there. She might go to Gavin, who would deny it with the smooth confidence of a man who had done this twice before and walked away clean. Without the element of surprise, without the moment of public exposure, Gavin could regroup, adjust, find another angle, or worse, she'd believe me. And the grief of it, the specific grief of discovering that a love you'd trusted completely was a transaction, would land on her all at once, without preparation, in the worst possible way. Option 2, wait. Build the complete case. Document everything. Let Gavin believe he was winning right up until the moment he wasn't, and trust my daughter. That last part was the hard part. Trusting that Grace, smart, perceptive, her mother's daughter in every way that mattered, was paying attention. That she might, on her own, arrive at the same place I had. I chose option 2. I told myself it was strategy. It was also partly hope. Hope that I was wrong about Gavin. Hope that the pattern Marco had found would somehow not apply here. Hope that my daughter's love was built on something real. Hope is a thing I don't usually let into my decision-making. Linda used to say that was my weakness. Maybe she was right. I called Naomi and told her to prepare a complete documentation package. Everything Marco had found, organized, and indexed, suitable for law enforcement review. I told her to hold it until I said otherwise. Then I called Sheriff Dale Briggs. Dale Briggs had been Clearwater County Sheriff for 11 years. We'd known each other for 22. He'd done some work on our property fence line back when he was still a deputy, and I'd still had the energy for the kind of neighbor relationships that turn into something like friendship. He was 58, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who fills a room without trying and doesn't need to try. I told him the whole story over coffee at his office. He listened the way good law enforcement listens, without interrupting, without editorializing, with the specific quality of attention that means he's filing and cross-referencing while you talk. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. The emails between Hatcher and the property attorney, he said. Those aren't criminal on their own, I know. And the developer conversations. He hasn't done anything illegal yet. Unethical, predatory, but I know, I said again. I'm not asking you to arrest anyone. I'm asking you to be at my ranch on September 6th as a guest. Civilian clothes, just watching. Dale looked at me for a long moment. And if something happens? I don't know yet what's going to happen, I said honestly. But I know that man is planning to use my daughter to take my land. And I know that when it comes apart, however it comes apart, I want someone with a badge in the room. Dale nodded slowly. I'll be there, he said. Front pew, third row, I said. I don't want him to see you and change his posture. Dale smiled. It was a small smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes but means something anyway. Been a while since I've been to a wedding, he said. The summer was the hardest thing I've done since Linda died. I watched Gavin move through the months between March and September with the patience and precision of a man who believed he was invisible. He continued asking questions about the water rights, about the timber permits, about whether I'd ever had an estate attorney look at the property's inheritance structure. Each time I answered simply and without alarm. Each time I watched his face register the information and file it. I watched him with my daughter. This is the part I don't know how to write without feeling the weight of it again. He was good with her, attentive, funny in the right moments. He remembered small things she'd mentioned and brought them back weeks later in ways that made her feel seen. I watched her bloom under it the way Linda used to bloom in spring, quietly, without making a performance of it, just expanding into the warmth that was offered. And I thought, what if I'm wrong? I went back to Marco's office in July and asked him to run the full check again. Everything current. New communications, new contacts, anything that had developed since March. He called me back in 4 days. Gavin had been in contact with Curtis Webb, the Cheyenne property attorney, twice since March. The most recent email, dated 6 weeks before the wedding, discussed post-marriage timelines and the specific language required in a separation agreement to secure partial property interest claims. I was not wrong. I went home and fixed the south fence line that had been needing attention since spring. Physical work. The kind that requires enough attention that you can't think about anything else. I worked until my hands hurt and the light failed, and then I sat on the porch in the dark and looked out at 215 acres of land that my wife and I had spent 30 years of our lives on. Grace found me there at about 9 o'clock. She sat in the chair beside me, Linda's chair, which neither of us ever quite treated as anything else, and we sat without talking for a while the way we've always been able to sit together. You doing okay, Dad? Yeah, I said, just thinking. She was quiet for a moment. You tell me if something was wrong, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I looked at her. I'd tell you what you needed to know when you needed to know it, I said. That's what I've always done. She looked at me for a long moment in the dark. Okay, she said. She went inside. I sat there another hour. She's paying attention, I thought. 6 days before the wedding, Naomi called me at 7:15 a.m. I want you to hear this before you hear it elsewhere, she said. Marco flagged something last night. Gavin has been in contact with a journalist, a business reporter at a Denver publication. He's been providing background information about the ranch's development potential, framing it as a family legacy property coming to market in the next 18 to 24 months. He's positioning himself as a source. I set down my coffee cup. He's preceding the story, I said. Yes, Naomi said. He's planning to move fast after the wedding, before you can restructure the estate. The journalist contact suggests he's thinking about building public pressure, making a sale seem like a community interest story. My jaw had tightened in a way I consciously relaxed. How long before it runs? The journalist hasn't filed anything. It's still sourcing stage. But Naomi, she caught herself. You need to move before he does. The wedding is Saturday, I said. I know. I have a plan. plan, I said. I know that too, she said. I just wanted you to know the clock is moving. I hung up, stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking at the North 40 in the early morning light. 6 days. I called Dale Briggs and told him to come dressed for a wedding. The morning of September 6th moved the way mornings move when something large is going to happen before the day ends. Slowly, with too much detail. Every ordinary thing performing its ordinary function with unnecessary vividness. The coffee was too hot. The light through the kitchen window was too bright. The sound of the caterers setting up in the barn was too clear. Grace was upstairs with her bridesmaids. I sat at the kitchen table with the documentation folder Marco had assembled. 31 pages, organized, indexed with tabs Naomi had added for the relevant statutes. And I read through it one more time. Not because I didn't know what was in it, because I wanted to be certain that every single thing I was about to do was justified by every single thing on these pages. It was. I put the folder in the inside pocket of my jacket. The ceremony was set for 2 o'clock. At 12:30, I walked to the barn and checked the setup. Hay bales covered in white fabric, because Grace had wanted something that looked like the ranch and also like a wedding, and that compromise was exactly right. White ribbons tied to the support beams, the old barn wood cleaned and polished to something close to gleaming. Linda would have loved it. At 1 o'clock, I found Dale Briggs by the water station near the south entrance. He was in a gray jacket and dark slacks, holding a glass of water, looking like exactly what he was supposed to look like. An older family friend, comfortable, unremarkable. We didn't speak for long. "Third row, right side," I said. "Already checked the sight lines," he said. "I'm good." At 1:40, I went to find Grace. She was in the small room off the barn's east side that we'd set up as a bridal suite. A nice way of saying we'd moved the equipment storage out, put in a mirror and some flowers, and let her bridesmaids work their considerable magic. When I knocked and came in, the bridesmaids did the thing that people do when they understand a moment is private and quietly dispersed. Grace was standing at the mirror in Linda's dress. I don't have the right words for what I felt standing in that doorway. I don't think the right words exist. She looked exactly like her mother and exactly like herself simultaneously, which is a thing that shouldn't be possible and was. I crossed the room and stood beside her at the mirror. "You look like her," I said. "I know," Grace said. "I checked about 40 times. We were quiet for a moment. Dad." Her voice had changed. Lower, more careful. She was looking at our reflections in the mirror, not at me directly. "I need to tell you something." My chest tightened. "I've been finding things," she said. "On his laptop. I wasn't looking. He left it open and I saw an email, and then I looked, and..." She stopped. "There were emails to a lawyer about property laws, about how quickly someone could file a claim on inherited land." Her jaw was very steady, her mother's jaw doing her mother's work. "And there were emails to a developer. He described this place, our place. He said he'd have decision-making authority within the year." She finally looked at me directly, not in the mirror. "You knew," she said. "Yes," I said. "How long?" "Since March." She took a breath, the kind of breath that holds a lot of things inside it. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to see it yourself," I said. "Or not see it. I wanted to be wrong. I hoped I was wrong." "You weren't wrong." "No." She was quiet for a moment. I watched her process this with the particular efficiency of someone who has already done most of the processing and is now just completing it. "What do we do?" she said. I reached into my jacket pocket and showed her the corner of the folder. "I have everything," I said. "And I have Dale Briggs in the 3rd row." Something shifted in her face. Not relief, more like the release of something that had been held at considerable tension for an unspecified period. "What do I do?" she said. "Walk down the aisle," I said. "Same as planned. When you reach me, put your hand on my arm and put whatever you need to say in my hand." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she reached up and straightened my jacket lapel with the precise, habitual gesture Linda used to use before anything important. "Okay, Dad," she said. 2 o'clock. The string quartet began. The barn doors opened. The guests rose. I walked to the end of the aisle and stood where fathers stand, and I watched my daughter appear in the doorway in her mother's dress, and the 200 people assembled on the hay bales on either side of me made the collective sound that people make when something is beautiful. Gavin stood at the altar. I watched his face as Grace moved toward us. For 3 full seconds, long enough to mean something, long enough for me to be certain he was not looking at her eyes. He was looking past her, over her shoulder, through the open barn doors at the meadow and the tree line, and the September gold of 215 acres shimmering in the afternoon light. 3 seconds. Then he found her face, and the smile came back, smooth and practiced and warm, and if I hadn't been watching for exactly that, I might have missed it. I didn't miss it. Grace reached me. She took my arm. The note landed in my palm with a small, definite weight. I walked. I kept my face forward. I unfolded it with one hand, smoothly, the way you open something you've been expecting. "Dad, help me. I found the emails. I know what he is. Please." The music kept playing for 3 full seconds after I stopped walking. Then it didn't. The silence arrived all at once, the way silence does when a room full of people simultaneously understands that something has changed. 200 faces turned toward me. Gavin's smile did not disappear. It froze. There's a difference. A disappearing smile is an emotional response. A frozen smile is a person calculating. I reached into my jacket. The folder came out clean. 31 pages, tabbed, indexed. I set it on the ceremony table in front of Gavin with the deliberate deliberate, unhurried motion of a man laying down a hand of cards he has been holding for 7 months. "I think we're done here," I said. The silence was total. And then, from 3 rows back, right side, moving with the unhurried authority of a man who has been waiting for exactly this, Sheriff Dale Briggs stood up. Gavin Hatcher's face went white, not pale, white. The color left so fast it looked like a drain had been pulled, like the performance had been running on a power source that just cut out. "Gavin," Dale's voice was conversational, friendly almost, the voice of a man who doesn't need to raise it. "I'm going to ask you to stay where you are for a moment." Gavin looked at the folder, at Dale, at the folder again. He looked at Grace. She was standing very still in her mother's dress, holding her bouquet, watching him with the clear, steady gaze of a woman who has already grieved this and come out the other side. "There are 2 property developers," I said, keeping my voice even, "who have emails from you describing this ranch in detail and identifying yourself as a future decision maker. There's a Cheyenne attorney who has 3 months of correspondence with you about marital property law and post-marriage asset claims. There's a Denver journalist who has you as a background source on a story about this land coming to market." I looked at him. "There are also 2 women, Rebecca Thornton and Sarah Mitchell, whose fathers have been contacted by my attorney." Gavin opened his mouth. Nothing came out. "You've done this before," I said. "You were careful. You were patient. You were very, very good at it." I picked up the folder. "But I spent 40 years finding the places where things are about to break. And you have a pattern, son. Same crack, same place, 5 times. From somewhere in the crowd, I heard a sound. A woman, one of Grace's friends, starting to cry. Not dramatically, just the quiet, helpless sound of someone watching something painful that was always going to happen." Gavin looked at Dale. "Am I under arrest?" "Not today," Dale said. "Today I'm here as a witness. What happens next depends on some decisions that are going to be made in the next few days by some people with a lot of documentation." He smiled pleasantly. "I'd recommend a good lawyer." Gavin looked at Grace one more time. She met his eyes. "I loved you," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "I want you to know I actually did, whatever that's worth to you." She turned and handed her bouquet to her maid of honor. Then she walked back up the aisle, not running, not crumbling, just walking with her mother's spine and her mother's chin, and 200 people parted to let her through. The weeks after September 6th moved the way aftermath always moves, in layers, some of them painful, some of them clarifying. Gavin retained an attorney, as Dale had suggested. Naomi filed a formal fraud complaint with the county, supported by Marco's complete documentation package. Curtis Webb, the Cheyenne property attorney, was reported to the Wyoming State Bar for ethics review. The Denver journalist killed the story when Naomi contacted her editor with the full context. Rebecca Thornton's father called Naomi 3 weeks after the wedding. He'd been waiting, he said, for something like this to happen. He was prepared to provide a sworn statement about the pattern if it came to that. Sarah Mitchell's family was harder to reach, but ultimately cooperative. No criminal charges were filed, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because fraud cases built on pattern behavior without a completed financial crime are difficult prosecutions, and Naomi was honest with me about the odds. What we had was enough to destroy his ability to run this particular play on anyone else. His name, his pattern, his methods, documented, formal, on record with law enforcement in 3 states. Sometimes exposure is the sentence. Marco sent me his final report on a Tuesday in October. One line at the bottom, below the summary, which I don't think was strictly professional, but which I appreciated anyway. Good outcome. The father did his job. Grace moved through it the way Grace moves through hard things. Not easily, not without cost, but forward. She took 2 weeks at the ranch. We fixed fence line together. We ate dinner without talking most nights, which is its own kind of conversation. One evening, she asked me to tell her about the patents, the whole story, how they worked, what they were worth. I told her everything. She listened carefully. "You've been very quiet about all of this for a long time," she said when I finished. "Yeah, why?" "I thought about Linda at sunset, looking at the ranch like something she couldn't believe was real. I thought about the note in the bouquet. 4 words in Grace's handwriting, the weight of it in my palm while the music played. Because the right things have a way of protecting themselves," I said, "if you've built them right." Grace looked out at the North 40 for a while. "Mom would say something like that," she said. "She'd say it better," I said. We sat on the porch until the light failed. The land was very quiet. The land has always been very quiet. It'll be here long after both of us are gone, and whatever comes after, and that's the whole point of it. Not the money, not the acres, not the development potential or the water rights or the timber on the North 40. Just the permanence of a thing built to last. Grace is going to inherit all of it someday. Now she knows exactly what it's worth.